attending this morning's politics and civility discussion. I'm glad we have such a good turnout today. I'm Rhonda Putney Gould. I'm Youth Services and Special Needs Consultant at Lakeshore's Library System, and I was asked to do the introductions and pace the event and moderate things. And I would just like to recognize the systems that have sponsored this event. It's Lakeshore's Library System, my own, Waukesha County Federated Library System, and we have Lori Freund here from their system, Kenosha County Library System, Eastern Shores, Milwaukee County Federated Library System, and I saw Jim here earlier. There he is. Okay. And the Milwaukee, UW Milwaukee SOIS. I think that's everyone. Oh, did I say Kenosha? Okay, all right. All right, so first off, I would like to introduce you to our panelists. We have Dr. Mordecai Lee, who is at the back of the room, and he'll be up here shortly to speak to us. There's Dr. Joyce Latham, who's also in the center of the crowd here. Mary Fournier from ALA will be speaking to us via internet, and also Martha Behringer from Madison, and she will also be speaking to us via web. Dr. Mordecai Lee is a third-generation Milwaukeean. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa from UW-Madison in 1970, and then received a PhD in public administration from Syracuse. In Washington, D.C., he was a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution, then a legislative assistant to a congressman from Milwaukee. Upon returning home in 1976, he was elected to the first of 3 terms in the state assembly, and then 2 terms in the state senate. After voluntarily leaving politics from 1990 to 97, he was the executive director of a faith-based nonprofit, the Milwaukee Jewish Council. In 1997, Mordecai joined the faculty at UWM's Continuing School of Continuing Education. He was granted tenure in 2002 and 4 years later promoted to full professor. He teaches graduate courses and non-credit workshops in public administration and nonprofit management, mostly in the areas of public relations, media relations, and legislative relations. In more recent years, Mordecai has been asked by news media to provide nonpartisan analysis of political developments in Wisconsin. He has been quoted by the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and has appeared on NPR, the NBC Nightly News, Fox Cable News, and The Rachel Maddow Show. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mordecai Lee.
Thank you very much. As you can tell, I've been around for a long time. And I remember politics when Democrats and Republicans used to talk to each other. And politics when Democrats and Republicans would compromise on a bill by discussing what their concerns were and solving problems. So that was a really long time ago. When you heard my biography, you heard that I left politics and went to the Milwaukee Jewish Council. And I just want to emphasize that when I left politics, I left it voluntarily, unindicted. In fact, the day I announced that I was leaving politics, Charles Benson, who's now at Channel 4, called me up and asked if he could come over and interview me about leaving politics. And he just put the microphone in my face. He said, "When's the indictment coming down?" And for the first time in my life, I was speechless. I'm really glad to be able to talk to you because these are interesting times and because a suburban Whitefish Bay kid like me grew up in public libraries. In fact, I'm so old that I remember the Whitefish Bay Public Library being in the basement of the police station on Lexington Boulevard. And I remember my second library card. The first library card was just cardboard. The second library card, so now this is like the late 1950s, it was cardboard except for a kind of a metal attachment that had a number. And then, so when you handed it in, they would pull down. Does anybody know? Right, and that was high tech. So in our lifetimes, we've really come a long way. My assignment the title of the event here is Politics and Civility. And my assignment is to talk about only politics because I'm against civility. No, I'm going to be talking about politics, and one of my colleagues from UWM and later speakers will be talking about the civility word in the title. I don't know who's going to be talking about and. So at least we're covering 2 of the 3 topics of your title. But I want to talk about what an amazing year and a half we've had in Wisconsin, and to talk about it in a nonpartisan manner, which is something that I think the younger generation doesn't know is possible. In my courses, I teach graduate students, and I say that we're welcome to talk about public affairs, about politics, about headline news, but you can't use any adjectives. And the students are sort of, what, I can't say that awful president or that great president or that. No, I said just describe what you're talking about, and then we can discuss it. And they really have trouble doing it. It's almost like for the generation that's grown up on Rush Limbaugh, and now Rachel Maddow, everybody in America is now a pundit, you know, and everybody has their take on events. And nobody can talk about the event itself. Rather, they talk about the politics of the event. And to me as a professor, this insults me as a professor. This is so anti-intellectual. I'd rather talk about the policy proposed by Mr. Romney, the policy proposed by the president, and so on. But it's almost like a lost art. And I think that in and of itself is a kind of a demonstration of how much has changed. And you in the library world are in a political world. You're obviously in the public sector. And you are affected by the tides of politics, by the tides of elections. You're part of municipal government. You're affected by the decisions of elected officials. First of all, the elected officials of your city board or town board or whatever municipal common council might be, and the mayor or whatever the equivalent title is. And you're affected by the decisions of the state legislature and state government. And you're also affected sometimes by the decisions of the federal government. So whatever it is the headlines are about partisan conflict, eventually filter down to having impacts on you and what you do. So let's try to sort of figure out what's been going on and how libraries are being impacted or may be impacted by these kinds of developments. The thing that strikes me about my experience as a politician, which goes all the way back to the 1980s, before cell phones, before fax machines, it was a different era. But in terms of the democracy with a small d, of elections, while technology has changed, the dynamics of politics and dealing with voters, I think, has changed in one very specific way in the last 18 months. When I would be campaigning, there were 2 comments I'd hear all the time. The first comment would be, it doesn't matter if I vote. My vote won't make a difference. And what's so startling about the events of the last 18 months is the public now understands that their vote does make a difference. We had an election for Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court election in the spring of 11, between Justice Prosser running for re-election and Ms. Kloppenberg. 1.5 million votes cast. The winner wins by 0.5%. Now, that, it seems to me, was the ultimate lesson for citizens that their vote can count. What was it, a lousy 8,000 votes or something? 7, thank you. I'm a tenured professor, I'm not good with details. But thank you. Or if you look at the recall race in Racine last month, the recall race was about 70,000 votes cast, and the winner won by about 800 votes. In other words, did I say 70,000? Okay. So the winner won by about 1% of votes. Again, an extremely small amount. And I think that for citizens who follow government, in other words, people who vote, this now has been for them the ultimate demonstration that their vote counts. And I think we're going to be seeing a change, a ripple effect of that as we go through the next few years. So that was one thing I used to hear when I was campaigning. The other thing I used to hear when I was campaigning was, there's no dime's worth of difference between the two parties. The difference between the two parties is the difference between Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Or sometimes they'd say between Tweedledum and Tweedledummer. And this was common to hear. And I would venture to say that there's not a single Wisconsinite who would say that today. As a result of the recall elections and the fight over Act 10, every Wisconsinite knows that there is a dime's worth of difference between the parties. That it is not a choice between Tweedledee and Tweedledum. That American politics is ideological. It's as ideological as Western Europe. And I'm reluctant to talk about the example of Western Europe because it's sometimes used in these partisan backs and forth about like healthcare and so on. But just like in Western European politics, you have a left party, you have a right party, easily identifiable by their views on issues and what they do if they win majorities. The same thing is true about American politics now, and especially true about Wisconsin politics. And that the Republican Party has a well fleshed out ideology of what they believe the role of government ought to be, and who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. And the Democratic Party has a well fleshed out, comprehensive viewpoint on what the role of government ought to be and who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. So now we're facing a situation where I think every voter in Wisconsin understands what Democrats stand for and understands what Republicans stand for. And the results of the recall race showed us how closely divided Wisconsin is. Now, it was, in political terms, it was a substantial, comfortable win for Governor Walker. But nonetheless, when there are only 5 or 6 points separating a winner and a loser, that, in political terms, that's not a landslide. Generally speaking, for pundits, when you get to 60-40, definitely when you get to 2-1, then it can be described as a landslide, a decisive one, an overwhelming. But notwithstanding the comfortable win by Governor Walker, I think it's still fair to say that Wisconsin is very divided politically, which the later speakers will get to in terms of talking about, therefore, what do you do to create a kind of neutral ground, or to get people to even be able to talk about politics without adjectives. But I think there are a couple of other trends that have happened in the last 18 months that are significant. The first trend that I think that you'll need to come to terms with is that in this increased ideologization, if that's a word, of politics, that we should expect that the Republican Party in Wisconsin is going to be the majority party in Wisconsin politics for the next decade. The Republican Party was the party that was able to control reapportionment. Now, generally speaking, what happens is that when a guy like me talks to somebody about reapportionment, I can actually see their eyes glaze over. Reapportion, by the time I finish the word, their eyeballs have rolled to the back of their head. Reapportionment is a boring subject, but it's about political power. And in fact, the Republican Party, which won the majority shifts in the two houses of the state legislature in November of 10 and won the governor's office, promptly used that political advantage to draw lines so that the remaining elections of this decade until the census of 2020 advantaged Republicans and disadvantaged Democrats. And so I think it's fair to say that even though today, as we speak, the Democratic Party is the majority party in the state Senate, this will be fleeting. This will be ephemeral. That by the time the results of the November elections are in, it will be clear that the Republican Party has made itself the majority party. Therefore, I think it's important for those who are affected by the decisions of elected bodies to realize that what we've experienced in the last year and a half in terms of legislative output, I'm not talking about the recalls and all that stuff, but what we've experienced in terms of the policies, the laws enacted in the last year and a half, and the funding levels enacted in the last year and a half, and the property tax levy limits that have been enacted in a year and a half, are the environment that you will be in as recipients of public funding for the rest of the decade. That the good times, whatever that means, and I don't mean it in partisan sense, are not around the corner. And to understand that while you've experienced government when sometimes the majority party was Democratic and sometimes the majority party was Republican, you've experienced government at times when the majority party was Republican. But I think the way to crystallize understanding of how much has changed is to talk about the governorship of Tommy Thompson versus the governorship of Scott Walker. Or even to talk about the political views of Governor Tommy Thompson versus the political views of candidate for U.S. Senate Tommy Thompson. That really captures how much has changed in terms of this increased ideologization of politics. And I think it's now fair to describe the Republican Party, if you want, as the Tea Party. In other words, that the Tea Party has swallowed the Republican Party whole. But it's probably more accurate and perhaps a little more vivid to say that the Republican Party is now the talk radio party. And I say that without negative connotations. I know Mark Belling. He used to have a TV show on Sunday mornings. For those of you who are old enough, you might remember I was sometimes on his Sunday morning TV show. Very bright guy, very impressive guy. And by the way, I should say, what you saw and hear on the air is what I saw and heard off the air. Mark Belling is a true believer, and it's not a persona that he puts on when they flip on the microphone. This is the real him. And what's important to understand is that, in a sense, the Republican majorities in the two houses and Governor Walker are talk radio Republicans. Now, what does it mean to be talk radio Republicans? It means to be conservative in a very different way that Tommy Thompson was conservative. It's not only the tone of politics, it's not only the anti-compromise, but it's the purity of the ideological position. And so what we've experienced in Wisconsin, the legislative output that we've experienced in the last year and a half, is very much talk radio Republicanism. This is what they believe in. Now, the reason that I mentioned Tommy Thompson is that, for those of you who are old enough to remember the governorship of Tommy Thompson, he was a very different kind of Republican than the governorship of Scott Walker. And again, I'm saying it without adjectives. But Tommy Thompson, in politics in Tommy Thompson's world, was that Wisconsin was roughly one-third Democratic, one-third Republican, and one-third independent. That in those days, there were swing voters. There were independent voters. We used to talk about the soccer mom. Soccer mom tended to be a suburban woman, sometimes a full-time homemaker, usually a college graduate. And the soccer mom was the ultimate example of an independent swing voter. She tended to be leaning right of center on economics and left of center on values. She felt comfortable sometimes voting for Democrats, sometimes voting for Republicans. Now, the revolution that we've seen before our very eyes is that the weekend before the recall election for Governor Walker, the number of undecideds was 3 to 4%. Everybody in Wisconsin had taken sides. We were not going into an election with 10, 20, 30% undecideds, which can be the case in lesser elections. So soccer moms have chosen sides, and Wisconsinites have chosen sides. So when you go back to the governorship of Tommy Thompson, Governor Thompson was a conservative, an authentic conservative, but he believed in using government to accomplish conservative goals. For example, W-2, the reform of welfare, or school choice, religious school choice in the city of Milwaukee. Those were authentic conservative goals, but if you'll remember, Tommy wrote a book after he stepped down from the governorship, and when I'm in front of librarians and I'm trying to remember the title of a book, I'm probably going to have to be careful. I think it was called Common Sense. Midwestern Common Sense, something like that. I know you're all going to go back and see how wrong I am. But what was so great about his memoir was that he talked about that he was pursuing conservative goals in ways that would seem to be fair-minded and reasonable to the soccer moms, to the independent voters, to that 1/3 of voters. And so Tommy Thompson's phenomenal success in Wisconsin politics, essentially governor for life, was because he used government for conservative goals and focused on issues that would appear to be reasonable to the soccer moms. That world has disappeared out from under our feet. And now what we have in politics is, I guess you call it the politics of the base. Base meaning, these are the people who are for you, through thick or thin. But these are the people who want you to be ideologically pure. These are not, the base does not want moderate politicians who work with the other side and engage in consensus building. What the base wants is highly ideal, and I'm talking about Democrats and Republicans, highly ideological, willing to stand their ground no matter what, pure candidates. In a sense, it's the opposite. Again, referring to the book. John F. Kennedy, before he was president, boasted a book called Profiles in Courage. And the whole book was about major elected officials who broke with their party because they put country above party. They put compromise above party. They put moderation above party. And again, I think that book captures how much has changed in our lifetimes. That there could be no Profiles in Courage 2. Because, in a sense, there aren't any. Because our political world has changed. One of the things that really struck me about when the Republican legislature took office in January of 11, having won the majority share in November of 10, was how much of what they did embodied the term repeal. If you'll recall from the November of 08 election until the November of 10 election, the majority party in the Wisconsin Assembly was Democratic, the majority party in the Wisconsin Senate was Democratic, and the Democratic Party was the governorship. And during that 2-year period, they killed many bills they didn't like, and they passed many laws that they really liked. And so what did the Republican majority do as soon as it came into power in January of 11? It repealed. And these are issues that some of us forget about. It wasn't just the high-speed train between Milwaukee and Madison, which was really sort of Exhibit A, but it was public financing of Supreme Court races. It was mandatory auto insurance levels of coverage. It was domestic partner benefits. early release of nonviolent state prison inmates, collection of racial information by law enforcement, wind energy siting rules, lakeside dock rules. Now, these are not the big issues, but I think what it shows is that as we have more ideological politics, that in a sense there are two statute books. There's the Republican statute book, and there's the Democratic statute book. And that whoever is the majority party is the one that will repeal the laws enacted by the opposite party and enact their laws. And that we're going to sort of end up with a body of laws that, in a sense, is never permanent. What you're used to is functioning in a legal environment that's permanent. I'm not sure that that can be said about the future. But getting more closely to what the impact of these developments has had and might ripple down to public libraries, it seems to me that the first lesson is the obvious lesson. Act 10 was a winner. The public, by the recall vote in June of 12, agreed with Governor Walker and agreed with the majority party of the state legislature that public employees were overpaid, overbenefited, and overcompensated. And that there was a need to rebalance the scales so that public employees would be in no better position than private sector employees. And while Act 10 per se only affected contributions by public employees to health care insurance and to pension insurance, except for people who are in the city and county, Milwaukee City and Milwaukee County systems. Anybody here from Milwaukee City and Milwaukee? Or employees in Milwaukee County? No, okay. Oh, okay. For employees of Milwaukee County, they have their own pension system. For employees of the city of Milwaukee, they have their own pension system. All other public employees are under the state system. No?
No, I thought you meant Milwaukee County Library System. You just mean employees.
Employees of Milwaukee County.
Got it.
Okay. So I think this is not the end of the story. Now, a lot of public employees sighed a breath of relief when Governor Walker earlier this month announced that as a result of a study of shifting the state pension system from what's called defined benefits to what's called defined contributions, which is essentially a 401k stuff, that while he was philosophically in favor of having a pension system for public employees that was comparable to what employees had in the private sector, which is defined contributions, 401ks. As a result of a study that is mandated by the legislature and appropriated $100,000 to do, he agreed with the results. He stated publicly that he agreed with the results of the study, and he was not going to propose a fundamental change in the Wisconsin pension system. And you could sort of hear the collective sigh of relief across Wisconsin for all the people who are in the system, whether we're talking about teachers, county employees outside of Milwaukee, municipal employees. But for those who read the rest of his statement, he also said, but that will not preclude me from recommending other reforms that would be in the best interest of the taxpayer. And I think one has to read both the first half of the statement and the second half of the statement as linked, which means that he is not going to be proposing a mandatory 401k system for everybody in the system, but he will feel comfortable proposing other changes in benefits or perhaps tinkering with the pension system short of this fundamental change. And if I had to make a guess, and somebody asked me for permission to take, so let me emphasize that this is a guess, and that I hope I won't be held accountable if I'm wrong, because I'm usually wrong. Just thank God for TV reporters who don't remind me of that. You know, I keep waiting for the time. Some of you have probably seen me sometimes talking to reporters on TV, and reporters love speculating about the future. You know, what is the implication of Governor Walker doing this, Tom Barrett doing that, and I'll spin off speculation. which is usually wrong. And I keep waiting for the day that a reporter is going to call me and say, Mordecai, I asked you about X and you were wrong, and then I'd ask you about Y and you were wrong, and I'm never calling you back again. They don't say that. They just call back for a new speculation. So, with all those caveats, I think the next thing that's going to go is, and I don't even know if this affects any of you, but when people in the state system retire, they're permitted to convert their remaining sick leave into paying premiums for health insurance. Am I saying it right? Okay. Is this a common thing? Okay. If I had to make a guess, that's the next thing that's going to go. And I'm not saying that to scare anybody. I'm not saying that to put your hair on fire. I'm just saying that this is a very uncommon thing in the private sector. And therefore, that should Governor Walker decide, or should a Republican legislature decide, they essentially would be saying the same things that they said about Act 10. All we're trying to do is we're trying to rebalance so that there's not a situation of public employees being the haves and private sector employees being the have-nots, or taxpayers being the have-nots. So, okay, thank you. I think there are going to be a couple other changes that I predict and will probably be wrong about. Not only is there likely to be much more recalls, I think the recall thread in Muskego was a really interesting event. Anybody here from Muskego? If I could summarize it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the City Common Council had opted to buy the old amusement park. I remember going there as a kid. It was a great roller coaster. And some taxpayers were against that and started circulating petitions to recall, I believe it was the mayor and the common council. And then, just for that one decision, and then eventually the mayor and the common council decided not to do it. I think that's the flavor of municipal politics to come. In other words, that municipal elected officials do not want to make controversial decisions and will fold at the lightest hint, the barest hint of a recall. And that this might affect you in ways that are unknown. I think a couple other things are going to be happening. You know, initiative and referendum, which is, we associate with California, Proposition 13, whatever it might be. Initiative and referendum is sort of only half adopted in Wisconsin. It sort of came at the tail end of the progressive era, and the Wisconsin progressives weren't sure they agree with it. And if I recall correctly, there's initiative and referendum that's permitted at the municipal level, but not at the state level. And can anybody correct me? Okay, thank you. I would make a prediction that just as recalls become this common phenomenon, I think initiative and referendum is going to come back. And who knows what issues a small group might decide is worth an initiative and referendum. And, I'm not saying this to scare you, I'm not saying this to say that for sure it's going to happen, but I think we should assume that that's coming. I think we can assume that there's going to be a sharp increase in performance measurement, budgeting based on performance measurement, and not necessarily the easy stuff. And the problem, of course, with performance measurement, and I'm not a fan of performance measurement, even though I'm a professor of public administration, the problem with performance measurement is it measures that which can be measured. And sometimes what government agencies do is a mission that really is unmeasurable. And so I don't particularly like it, but I'm sure some of you already have to do performance measurement reporting to your municipal level of government. I think it's going to continue and increase. There's no doubt that property tax levels are going to be increasingly strangled, sort of like a garret, between the pressures of increased expenditures and the state property tax levy limits and cuts in state aid. And you've already experienced that over the last 10 years. But I think you ain't seen nothing yet. Now, as a result of this, sort of what might be some more specific things that are relevant to libraries? And here I'm sort of stepping off a cliff. I'm playing the professor who's talking about something he knows nothing about. So please feel free to disregard any speculation. I think as a result of digitization and the internet, we're just around the corner from a virtual library. We're around the corner from not needing a bricks and mortar library, where any book, any movie can be downloaded by a citizen onto their whatever device they're using. And that they really never need to go to the library. And that the people coming to your library are probably going to be increasingly gray-haired and increasingly sort of fading out. Now, you've done many things to make libraries exciting places for kids, and it still is. But I think the inexorable tide of the internet is going to gradually chip away at the bricks and mortar library. And that increasingly, when you turn to your city administrator, mayor, village council, town council, city common council, increasingly they might be sort of looking at you like, do we really need that library? Do you really need to buy these hardcover books? No. Isn't it enough that you're buying the digital rights to this book? I think you're going to be seeing an increasing skepticism about budget levels and services. And again, I'm not saying this to scare you, and for all I know, I'm totally wrong. But I think this is coming around the corner. Now, one of the fascinating things that's happened in Wisconsin politics is how adept the University of Wisconsin system has been to riding the tide of whatever is popular. And if you'll recall, over the last couple of years, when there's discussion about why is Wisconsin so slow in economic development, so lagging in employment, and I'm not saying that as a partisan comment, why is that? And for some reason, the literati and the cognoscenti and the great mentioners that the media refers to have decided that it's because Wisconsin has a lower than average population who are college graduates compared to, let's say, Minnesota. And so the thinking by these policy wonks is that, well, if Minnesota has a higher percentage of college graduates, and Minnesota is doing pretty good economically, do I have to wrap up?
No. About 10 minutes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. You've been a great audience.
I'm sorry.
No, that if Minnesota has a higher than average percentage of the population who are college graduates, and Minnesota is doing pretty good economically, and Wisconsin has a lower than average percentage of the population who are college graduates compared to Minnesota, and Wisconsin has lower economic performance, then here's where the leap comes. Surely it must be that if Wisconsin can increase its percentage of college graduates, that Wisconsin will be in better shape economically. Now, for somebody who teaches policy analysis, I think that's confusing cause with correlation. I don't know that Minnesota is doing better because it has a higher percentage of college graduates. But that's irrelevant in politics. The bleedings of people like me aren't heard by the decision maker. Somehow it has become the conventional wisdom of Wisconsin politics that we need to increase the number of college graduates. And the University of Wisconsin has been perfect, has been pitch perfect about jumping onto the crest of that wave. And so all of a sudden the University of Wisconsin is talking about how we need to have a higher percentage of the population of college graduates, which happens to benefit the University of Wisconsin as a bureaucracy. You know, this is the same University of Wisconsin that 10 years ago politicians were complaining was overstaffed and overbuilt and overcost and anything like that. But politics and policy are, in a sense, ahistorical. There is no past. You can jump on any wave you want And I'm really impressed by how the UW system has jumped on this wave, and nobody's criticizing it. No, I'm talking large generalities. Now, I remember a time when Henry Meyer was mayor of Milwaukee, which again shows. And Henry Meyer wanted, at the time, I think it was sort of the 80s, maybe 90s, the economy wasn't in good shape. And Mayor Meyer wanted an economic development initiative. And that the city could do things to increase the economic condition of the city government, could do things to increase the economic condition of the city population. And one of his proposals was that the Milwaukee Public Library could be, and this is where my memory sort of fades out, could somehow play a role in this new city government initiative for economic development. And I can't remember if it was a source of information or because it was a depository library or because it had all those old patent books from British patents. But
I think it was because they had so much property.
because they had so much property, okay. But he saw the public library as an element of political success in convincing the voters of the city of Milwaukee that he had a plan for the economic development of the city and that the public library was part of it. I wonder if that gives a hint about where libraries can go in the future, of how public libraries can, in a sense, be like the University of Wisconsin system, can jump on this bandwagon of economic development. And I'm sure this is not a new idea, and I'm sure it has been talked about before, but how you become where entrepreneurs go for knowledge. How you are the place where ideas are born. The place where America's capitalist system begins. I mean, whatever it might be. And there's enough of a sort of a logical basis for it that people go to the libraries to do research, to learn about how to apply for this or how to qualify for that, to get employment information, to use the PCs for internet research, whatever it might be. And I sort of wonder if you're facing, within a generation, the virtual library and the end of the bricks and mortars library, if, as these political waves, these fads happen, if there are ways for you to, in a sense, rebrand yourselves so that you are part of the fad. Remember that being a politician, and I'm wrapping up. Being in politics is sort of like being in high school. You want to be popular. You want to do and say things that make people like you, and you want to not do and not say things that would make people not like you. And so being successful in politics is like sort of running for class president or being the most popular kid in the grade or whatever it might be. So politicians want to be on the side that makes them look good. They want to be for what makes them look good. And they want to be against what makes them look bad. And we're living in an era that being against excessive spending is the right place to be. And against the bureaucracy. And against all these over-pampered public employees. And against the whole list of what you've heard on the state level in Wisconsin politics over the last year and a half. And they want to be for what their constituents want, which is high quality services, right? The library open 24 hours a day, whatever it might be. They want to be for it, and especially we're living in this fad era of economic development. They want to be for economic development. And there are other fads present currently, and there will be other fads over the next 5 and 10 years. The question is how you can place and re-image a public library from being on the tax spender side to the taxpayer benefiter side. And of course you have built-in constituencies of people who are for public libraries. But I think we're in an era when that's not going to be enough. And where there's a need for, in a sense, a new political coalition that can help you deal with what is bound to be sort of a tough decade. So, as the apocryphal politician said, them's my views. If you don't like them, I'll change them. So thank you very much. I think we've got a little bit of time for about 10 minutes to tell me how wrong I am and how out of touch I am. Or just for conversation without adjective, except criticizing me, sure.
I have a question for you. How do you think the legislature's decision to retool WISNET will affect all of us next year?
Okay, I'm in the embarrassing position that I don't know what retool WISNET is.
WISNET is and those of you who are more tech savvy, help me out here a little bit, the backbone of our internet service within the state. It's a service that's provided in conjunction with the university.
Oh, and there was a fight about whether
Yes.
this was competing
Whether it should
with
be
the private
privatized
sector.
or not, yes.
And it does, and it's more efficient.
And it's gonna cost anywhere from 3 to 5 times more for us to get it from the private sector than the university.
Sorry.
It's a really tough thing to talk to an elected official and say that you support government competing with the private sector. That's a really tough thing. Now, up to now, as I recall, on that policy fight, we've been relatively successful. Because I think the money, maybe some of the money was Fed money. But there's a very interesting thing about Governor Walker, and I think we're going to be seeing it more from the public legislature. They don't consider federal money to be free. They consider federal money to be taxpayer dollars. And as you're seeing in the fight about the health care law and the local exchanges and Medicare, the expansion of Medicaid under the Obama bill, they're not afraid to turn down what is essentially free money, because from their ideological point of view, it's not free money, it's taxpayer money. And that if all American politicians were to have the same point of view, then they'd be able to shut down the enemy, the beast. You could starve the beast. So I'm not sure how that's going to play out. Now, it would be great for you guys to be able to say that through this network, you'll be able to help people get jobs and create jobs. If I hear the phrase job creator one more time, I think I'm going to turn off my TV and not turn it back on until after the November election. But whether you like it or not, whether you agree with it or not, the phrase of the day is job creation. And so anything you can do to repackage your arguments so that you're pro-job creator, all the better.
I think that from the WISNET thing, the important thing for all of us to be doing is going and meeting with the politicians and explaining to them the details of this. I had a discussion with a county executive about it who had no idea that it was going to cost the universities and the libraries and the schools more to eliminate WISNET. And I think that it made him go and investigate the details of it, which he didn't know before. So I think it's important that we all go and meet as much as possible with our local politicians present on a municipal as well as a county level, and have them looking into this and realizing that even though, yes, we want to promote the private sector, we don't want to do it if it's going to cost the taxpayers more.
And if I could add to it, I'll call in just a second. That's great advice. And also an indication of how so many elected officials are really not interested in policy. All they're interested in is winning elections. And that a little bit of information, authentic information, can go a long way. But let me just mention that there's one tactic that is more powerful than that. And that's, instead of the public librarian meeting with the elected official, it's a constituent meeting with the elected official. There is no more powerful word in democracy, as it should be, than the word constituent. This person is a voter. This person has a family. This person has cousins and nieces and nephews who live in my district. This person has neighbors who live in my district. This person is active in civic groups that live in my district. I don't want to poison the well. And what surprised me about my experience in politics is when I was an assemblyman, I represented about 60,000 people. And then when I was a state senator, every state senate district is 3 assembly districts. So I represented 3 times that number of people. What amazed me is that I had thought from before I got interested in politics that if I were representing 150, 200,000 people, that I could slough off any one individual. But that's not how politicians operate, because politicians understand that one person can poison the well. And the converse, one person can add water to the well. That there's a multiplier effect to good news or bad news. So,
As long as you can make sure that they can answer his questions and have enough information in there.
but let me give you an example from my own experience in politics. I'll call you in a second. I promise this gentleman. The pro-life movement, and I'm guessing some of you in this room are pro-life, some of you are pro-choice. We're keeping sort of politics outside of this room. The pro-life movement is phenomenal about having rank-and-file citizens understand the subtleties of parliamentary procedure and calling up their elected official or emailing their elected official with incredibly detailed requests that they understand, that they're not merely sort of parroting something that they were told, that they understand that the motion next week on reconsideration of the motion to table the pro-life bill X or the pro-choice bill X, they understand the significance of it. Now, I don't think supporters of libraries would be in sort of the kind of intense place that pro-lifers are, pro-choicers are. But it tells you that there can be highly informed citizen advocates. This gentleman and then that gentleman. This gentleman.
And it probably dovetails a little bit, yes. I think when being on the edge of the Northwood, when we were expressing our concerns to our elected representatives, I think the people that, he was hearing public libraries, but the constituents that he was hearing as much as anything were underserved populations in the rural areas, and of course you go north of Merrill, you find lots of areas where the internet does not exist virtually, bandwidth certainly does not exist, and public libraries, institutions, but more importantly, hospitals and health-related institutions. And while we affect a lot of constituents, probably more are affected by the idea of hospitals getting internet access.
That's fabulous advice. When I was working for the Milwaukee Jewish Council, the Jewish population had certain interests, certain policy areas, social justice, equality, anti-bigotry. But our internal motto was always coalition building. And sometimes your coalition partner on one issue was your opponent on another issue, and that was fun. And so this coalition was a voice that was so much more powerful than just, let's say, the voice of individual life. That's great advice. Sir?
With everything so kind of rancorous and side split, when you talk about poisoning the well, my thought is somebody might see that person, a politician might see that person, well, you're not going to vote for me anyway. I have to keep my side happy to keep those votes and that support coming in. Is that poisoning the well, is that as important as it used to be?
No, that's a great insight. And when I was talking about base politics, you really get into the heart of base politics. In particular, yes, a Democrat will ignore a rank-and-file Republican, a Republican will ignore a rank-and-file Democrat. But whether that elected official is a Democrat or Republican, if they view that person at all as winnable, in other words, if this smaller and smaller slice of non-base voters, of authentic swing voters, merit-based voters, if that person could be what politicians call a persuadable, then they would take it very seriously. I think my time has expired, so I'd like to thank you very much.
For those of you who have not been here before, I've been remiss in not pointing out where the restrooms are down the hall. We have refreshments back here, please help yourself. At this point, I think we'll take a break after Dr. Latham is finished, but I'd like to introduce her and give her a chance to get her set up here for her presentation. Okay, all right. All righty, I cannot see this, I'm sorry. Joyce Latham comes to LIS Education after an extended career in libraries. With a background in cataloging and technical services, she became closely involved with retrospective conversion and automation projects. She was the head of automated services at the Southern Maryland Regional Library and worked on the development of the statewide Sailor project. From there, she went to Chicago Public Library as the head of information technology. After 3 years at the University of Illinois studying the social influences on the development of intellectual freedom in public libraries, she went to upstate New York as a library/public library system director. At the completion of her dissertation, she came to the School of Information Studies, where she specializes in public libraries, intellectual freedom, and library history. Her revisionary research focus is on the activist role of librarians in the development of culture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joyce Latham.
I want to talk a little bit about when we talk about the kinds of roles that public libraries are trending toward. I think there are a lot of options for us out there. I don't think we have to commit ourselves to becoming virtual libraries. I think, I think our communities want us to be there as brick and mortar installations. I think we are a long way away from that changing, in my opinion. And of course, I'm betting my career on this. Yes. But I do believe it. But I do think that the focus on collections as the heart of the library is what needs to shift. And I'm not saying that we need to give it up, but I think we need to reinvigorate our practice with a strong community engagement base. All right? And I think when we look at some of the strategies that we've had in the past, it's a way of looking at what we can do in the future. And so I'm going to propose that we investigate the concept of the public library as an agent that facilitates what I call an interpretive community, which is a community that comes together to talk about itself and what it wants to be. And that the library is the natural place for that to happen because it provides open space. All public, I don't know any public libraries anymore that don't have community rooms. Are there any here that don't? You know, the community rooms. And also have the resources to support public investigation. Right? So the concept of an interpretive community is also a welcome concept for us because it comes out of literature, where people would come together to talk about understandings of particular works. So interpretive communities would occur around works. We're talking about interpretive community occurring in a particular public space. And we can facilitate and create that space. So I also like to say this. I talk about what my history has been in terms of the facilitation of the digitization of public library practices, because I'm one of the people that can then say, and that's done, and let's move on to the next thing. All right. So technology ate our libraries in many ways. We were faced with a pressing need to make a transition to a digital framework. And we rose up and we met that need. I mean, we understand how to handle the challenges of the future and the present. We've done it already. We've done it in ways that other institutions had to catch up to. I hate to tell you how many projects we as public librarians digitizing the library, we consulted on in terms of the private sector and other parts of the public sector. The libraries were out in front, and we can continue to be out front. So, the idea behind the public library and public discourse is going back and reinvigorating our role as public libraries as agents of democracy. And what I'm suggesting is that through enabling public discourse, that democracy then becomes the means to solve the problems of democracy. And in Wisconsin here, we're kind of embedded in the problems of democracy. We're actively working with, as Dr. Lee was talking about, these ideological frameworks that are having impact not only at state levels, but within our communities. And so we are uniquely positioned to enable a democratic engagement with our democratic issues. The interpretive community, the concept of interpretive community. Okay, so who knows what this is? Anybody? This is the Lyceum. The Lyceum was where Socrates and all those guys hung out and engaged in public discourse. Right? Anybody know what this is? This is a picture from the summer school for workers, which was where working class people came together in the University of Wisconsin to talk about their issues and to learn skills in engaging with political activity. And then this is a poster from one of the Chautauquas that are still going on. We still have an active Chautauqua movement in this country, which is a movement. I'm going to talk about it some more in a minute. So, but that's an image from the Chautauquas. So, interpretive community raises the question for us about who helps us understand our own experience of the world, and how do we refine what we think we already know? Because the problem is not what we don't know, but the assumptions we make about what we already know, and being willing to bring them into question and bring them up for discussion. So, public discourse in public libraries. What I'm going to talk about today is the challenge of neutrality, the roots of public library forums. I'm going to look specifically at the John Thoman Branch and the American Heritage Project, and then I'm going to point out some contemporary options that are already in play, which will be a nice setup for the ALA folks to come in and talk about their initiatives. So the Chautauquas were originated with an Ohio inventor, Lewis Miller, and a Methodist bishop, John Vincent. And the Chautauquas were, they began in western New York State in 1874. They were where a group of people would come together. Usually it was starting in Chautauqua, New York, and out on the grounds, these beautiful grounds, and sometimes they had a tent set up, a big tent, like a circus tent. Sometimes they used the building, but they would come together for these lectures, and then the lectures would stimulate discussion among the audience. And these were large crowds, these were not small. So that began in western New York. In the Bowery, New York, there was a place called the People's Institute. And again, it was where just everyday people would come together. Remember, there was no TV, there was no radio. So at this point in time, public discussion was a means of public entertainment. it's kind of like having MSNBC, you know, up in front of you. So that this was how people negotiated their understanding of particular either historic events or current events. There was an open forum movement that started in 1910 that was church-based, Protestant churches. There was the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which launched the adult education movement in 1924. They launched it through the American Library Association in 1924, and then spawned off an adult education arm of its own in 1926 with funding. There's the Summer School for Working Girls, I showed you that picture, which was launched in 1925 in Wisconsin, which became the School for Workers. The John Tolman Branch Forum, 1931, which started in the Chicago Public Library. It was a bottom-up movement. It started in the community and was housed in the library. The Czech community, immigrant community there launched that. There was the American Way Initiative in the 1930s, which started in Iowa when John Studebaker was the superintendent of education there. When he became the Commissioner for Education for the United States under, what's his name? FDR, it became a national program. So again, something based on the Chautauquas where people came together, listened to a lecture, and engaged in discussion. And then there was the American Heritage Project, which launched in 1950, came out of the New York Public Library, and again became a national program directed by the American Library Association. So I'm going to talk specifically about the bottom-up program, which came out of Chicago. I did my dissertation on the public library unions in Chicago in the 1930s. So I know quite a bit about that. And I'm also going to talk specifically about the American Heritage Project because I think it's a great setup for us to talk about what we can do now. First, though, we have to come to grips with this concept of neutrality and what it means. And that's West Bend, just in case of So what does the concept of neutrality mean to us as practitioners? And this is one of the really, this is one of the slippery slopes, because what I think a lot of public librarians have done is they've taken this commitment to neutrality and said, well, I can't do anything. Well, library is neutral. We don't take any positions. We don't engage in any discussions. And so they abandon the terrain that should be their own. Right? So neutrality becomes it becomes an I can't instead of an I can. And neutrality is really a very enabling concept. It really sets public libraries up as the premier places to advance this kind of discussion. Because we don't have a commitment to one perspective or another. That's exactly why we can bring public discourse into our communities. And there are libraries that are doing it. I have a talk, my adult services class every year. So because we're neutral, we have a certain level of authority. We've gone to library school. We've developed a sense of expertise and skill sets that give us the authority to determine the difference between propaganda and fact. So who's got a good example of propaganda? Anybody? What would you call propaganda today? Yeah.
A lot of times in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, when you open, for those of you who still look at it in paper, they have that truth meter. And I find that a very interesting, commentary on sort of fact and propaganda. So it will take a quote from generally a politician and then say, well, yes, mostly true, no, or pants on fire.
Yeah, that's a good example. Thank you. An example of propaganda that comes up for us a lot as public librarians is the Holocaust deniers. All right? Great example. We know there was a Holocaust. We know it's a fact. It's a physical fact. And so our collections represent the fact of the Holocaust, right? The propaganda is that there was no Holocaust. And so we're not as inclined to add that kind of propagandistic material to our collections. We have the authority to determine the difference. We have the intellectual education to determine the difference between propaganda and fact. And our role, if we think back, our roots are in the Enlightenment, and the idea that what we want to do is present the best information for people to engage in the best pursuit of their own intellectual concepts. You know, that's what we do. That's what we do with our authority. We create the kind of balanced collections that enable people to engage with those questions of their own. And we do that through the practice of evaluation and assessment. We know our communities. What I do in one community is not going to be the same thing I'm going to do in another community. Different communities have different personalities. They have different needs. And we actively engage in the assessment of those community needs, and we develop the programs that respond to the needs. Okay? That's what we do. We don't sit back. We become active investigators of what our communities need. We can do it through surveys. We can do it through walk-in investigations. We can do it through going out and meeting with leaders within our communities to find out what needs they experience. But all of that becomes part of how we engage with our communities. But the concept of neutrality is what enables us to do that. Because everybody knows when the library comes in, when the librarian comes in, the only agenda that the library has is delivering intellectual tools to its community that enables the members of that community to make good, informed decisions about how to live their lives. You're not saying you should live it this way. You're not saying you should live it that way. But we're definitely saying you should live it. And you should live it in an informed way. The library can do that because the library has no position on how to live your life. Just live your life. So, let's talk about some examples of this from the past. The Toman Branch Library, John Toman was he was an alderman in Chicago. He was Czech. He was one of the aldermen who called for Chicago to secede from the state of Illinois because he felt that the city was underrepresented at the state legislature. He was right. His proposal was passed by the city council, by the city alderman, but never actually acted on it. But it was approved. But he also went on then to become the sheriff of the city of Chicago. And during his lifetime, they named this branch library after him. And the original idea behind the library forums as they emerged was to explore the idea of what it meant to be American. So this was on the southwest side of the city of Chicago, down a highly industrialized area, a lot of immigrants, an intense Czech concentration of Czech immigrants, an intense Czech, the Russian immigrants weren't far, So you had a lot of new Americans there. And so they used this Tolman Branch Forum as a way of investigating what it meant to be American. It was community-based. The community organized this themselves with the two librarians that managed the library at that point. So you had people like the editor of a local paper named Harvey Mitchell, and Otto Opdine, who was a lawyer, and Anton Bosch, who was a gardener and an art collector. You know, I think a gardener, and I think of art collector, they don't normally go together, but Charles Vetter, who was an AFL later official, and Thomas Cermak, who was a merchant, and a member not related to the mayor at that point in time. The mayor was killed after 2 years. He was assassinated in an attempt on FDR's life. So what you have here is a community interest. We want to talk about what being American means to us. And we want to come together and we want to do this in a collective way. And so these guys got together and they started organizing it. And the head librarian was Helena Hamill. And she described the group in 1936, and I love this quote, as well-balanced politically. 2 being conservative, 2 radical, 3 liberals. Now, you know, we don't have any radicals anymore. They've kind of gone by the by. But I love this. I love how engaged the librarians were with advancing the causes that this group brought together. So we have a political discourse taking place in the community, and some are conservative, and some are liberal, and some are like really radical. And they are able to come together to plan their own discourse, and they're going to have it happen in a public library. So the first program was held in January in 1932, and it was presented by the Czech Consul General, and it was speaking on the present conditions in Czechoslovakia. 108 people attended this first program. How would you count an attendance of 108 at a program in your library? Pretty good, right? Pretty good. For the first half year, Tolman offered 8 program lectures with a total attendance of 837. So that's averaging over 100. Now, you have to, I looked for a picture of the interior of the John Tolman. It was a small library, it's not a big library. They would empty out the children's room, and they borrowed chairs from the funeral, you know, the funeral home down the street, so that they would have enough seats for everyone. And they did that for a couple of years until the library board finally figured out they should probably buy them some extra chairs. But so they would move everything in the children's room aside in order to get everybody in. During the second season, a debate on the restriction of immigration drew an audience of 254 into this little library. While a program on diet and health and disease, which was illustrated with slides, which I think was the big draw, 345 people to a program. So the idea that the library is a focus not just for getting materials and checking them out, but coming to engage with new knowledge and to encounter new delivery systems for that knowledge was very much a role that this little public library pursues. It's a small public library. And this, I mean, Tolman is an example of what many libraries were doing at this point in time. The Tolman Branch project was based on a project similar to one conducted by a Czech community in Cleveland. So the Cleveland, there was a branch, oh gosh, okay, the name of the branch just right out of my head. head librarian there was Ledbetter. And they had launched the same kind of program where they set up a lecture discussion series for the members of their community and also had the same kind of turnout taking place with it. So in the second season, they offered 12 lectures with a total attendance of 2,181. Now, we know a lot of them are repeats, but even so, that's an incredible draw for a branch library. 1933 began with a political symposium addressing the topics of Rooseveltism, socialism, fascism, and communism. All right, so what we have is a public institution supporting these public discussions on what are obviously heated topics. I mean, the mere phrase Rooseveltism makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck. Kind of sounds like Obamacare. You know, socialism and communism were very dynamic energies at this point in time because, you know, there had been a socialist party that had actually gotten like 8% of the vote 10 years before, and the Communist Party was launched in Chicago in 1921. So what you have are some really active issues that are on the table and being discussed in the community. In 1938, this is one of my favorites, there was a presentation by the labor lawyer William Rodriguez of the Chicago Civil Liberties League on the dangers of fascism in the United States, which featured a viewing of the film of the South Chicago Steel Strike, also known as the Memorial Day Massacre in 1937, 137 attended. Why is that such a big deal? The film was banned in the city of Chicago. The film had been shot by a reporter from St. Louis. And it was circulated all over the country. It had never been shown in Chicago. You know, it happened up the street from this library. You know, so when they showed this film, they were breaking the law. You think it didn't have some repercussions? It did, but it turned out good. It turned out good. So the shootings were in 1937. You know, 10 people were killed, a number were wounded. And the film shows the Chicago police literally shooting people in the back. So the film was shown in March of 1938, and in January of 1939, there was this intellectual freedom challenge launched against the Forum. This is how I learn all this stuff. It's about my intellectual freedom stuff. So there's this intellectual freedom challenge. The members of the community go to the Board of Trustees of Chicago Public Library Board of Trustees and say, "Oh, they're too radical down there in that John program." And the Board of Trustees says, "We passed an intellectual freedom policy in 1936 that applies to collections, and we are extending the coverage of that intellectual freedom policy to cover our programs throughout the city of Chicago. Not just for this forum, but for all forums." So what we have here is a real movement toward the definition of the public library as an institution of open access for the engagement of ideas, no matter whose ideas and where they come from. This is before the ALA passes its intellectual freedom policy. So this predates by 6 months the ALA practice. The 1936 policy predates ALA's policy on intellectual freedom by 2.5 years.
How much of these symposia were presentations by selected experts to speak on the topic, and how much of it was active participation of the audience?
It was 50-50. The timing, the day, the way the programs were set up was they'd have someone come in, they ran for like 90 minutes. So someone would speak for 45 minutes, and then they'd have discussions for 45 minutes. The article that talks about this is due out next spring. So, but in many cases, they just spilled over even past the time periods. So it's both.
And are you gonna go into the moderation of the discussion portion of these types of events?
I'm not, I don't have that in the slide. I can tell you, for instance, that the previous program, the one on, let's see, the one on Rooseveltism, yeah, the one on Rooseveltism, socialism, fascism, and communism was moderated by a community leader. All right, Roderick Ginsburg, who was known as a voice of the Czech community within the Czech community. And he was the one that put the panel together and moderated. Okay, but it was housed and moderated. So yes, you have some community authority there that's part of the discussion. Paul Douglas in April 1938 drew 401 people into it. Does anybody here know who Paul Douglas was? I worked in Illinois for a while, so he was the senator, the U.S. senator with a bow tie. There should be enough of you to remember that. But he spoke on the role of Czechoslovakia in Central Europe in 1938. What happened right after this is that the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia. So that was part of it. Now that gives you some detail on a branch library forum. This particular forum lasted into the 1960s. Even as it underwent population shifts, the library remained committed to enabling the forum to happen. These large numbers began to go down, but the smallest number that attended a program which was on something to do with youth was 52. So I don't know about y'all. I would have been happy with 52 attending the program in one of my libraries. So again, they didn't have a lot of competition in terms of television and radio, although some libraries did offer radio programs where they would have listening sessions. People would come together to listen to the radio together. They would sometimes have programs on music programs where the library would set up recordings of LPs and play LPs for the public. So opera was very popular because opera was hard to get and expensive if you could find it. So the library would buy some of the more expensive, hard to get recordings and then do programming around those recordings, things to bring people in. So the idea being that the library was not just an agent of political discourse. This would tend to indicate that. But there are a range of programs. When you read my article, you see it has much more detail. But Princess Tatiana, who came in and she was a famous mezzo-soprano at the time and actually sang. So and they had music groups. But the reason I wanted to focus on the political topics for our chat today is because I want us to be aware of the fact that it's possible for the public library to be hospitable to the discourse, all right? To be hospitable to the discourse, the occurrence of the engagement, without risking life and limb to get it done. So the next thing I said how am I doing for time on it?
We've got about 15, 20 minutes.
Oh, good, that should work. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was this idea of exploring the American idea. It was a program that originated in New York Public Library and expanded to become a national program, and we'll talk about that. It was stimulated by the Freedom Train. And if you see that little graphic up there, it's, that's the Freedom Train. The Freedom Train carried 40 important historic documents to the democracy of the United States. So things like the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, you know, documents that, that reflected the democratic foundation. Now this is taking place in 1950. What's going on in 1950?
Red Menace.
The Red Menace. The Red Menace, McCarthyism. It's the era of McCarthyism. Nobody could take on McCarthy front on and keep their job, right? If you took McCarthy on head on, you got blacklisted. It was as simple as that. So people began to develop other strategies. So one of the strategies was, let's talk about where America came from. Let's talk about the base roots of the American democratic idea. And so the American Heritage Project launched this train carrying the documents, the Freedom Train. And the Freedom Train would visit different cities and stop and enable people to file through the different cars and look at the documents. And did anyone ever do the NASA? Years ago, I was going to bring the poster in my lifetime. They had a similar kind of exhibit from NASA that went around, only instead of being in train, it was in big trucks.
So the Dream Flight.
The Dream Flight?
The
is
Dream
that-
Flight exhibit, it was just in Wausau a couple weeks ago.
Was it? Okay. Well, years ago, I visited it in North Carolina when I was working in the foothills of Blue Ridge Parkway. Beautiful place. And so it was similar. It's similar to that, you know, that the train would go to different communities, and then everybody would be able to go follow on the train, see the documents, and then engage in some discussion about what those documents meant. So in New York Public, when it came to New York, there was a committee on the American tradition at New York Public in 1950. And it was taught, who knows Margaret Monroe? Yeah, we got some Madison grads here. Margaret Monroe taught at Madison. But she got her start in adult services in New York Public Library. Not her start, but her big splash came there. And so they established this committee on the American tradition. And they set up this reading and discussion program that had recommendations but not requirements. So it was kind of based on the great books discussion, but not, you know, because the great books was too hoity-toity, and this was a lot more grounded in the community. So communities could pick their own readings that they wanted to pursue. The librarians had a list of recommendations, but the communities picked out what they wanted to read. So they picked this quote from David Lilienthal, who you may know as, you may recognize him in terms of the This I Do Believe. Remember that series that NPR did for a while? This I Believe. It drew from this program. So he had written this book, and it focused on a quote from him. What, as individuals, can we do to safeguard and nourish this great inheritance that draws on the document? I say, search our minds and our souls and find out what it is we believe about democracy and about America. So once again, here we have a public library saying, we are going to reestablish our relationship with the concept of the public library as an agent of democracy. We are going to actively do that. And so what do we know about Lilienthal? Well, HUAC, the House on Un-American Activities, McCarthy investigated Lilienthal for his supposed communist attachment. Lilienthal had been the director of the Tennessee Valley Authority under Franklin Roosevelt. So because he was associated with Roosevelt, he was associated with radical politics. And he wrote this, I do believe, as a response to Hugh Adler. So when New York Public says, you know, we're going to talk about what democracy means in this country, and we don't mean you, McCarthy, it's kind of like a side comment, you know. We're going to talk about what democracy means to us, you know, what we think it is. And by using the quote from Lilienthal, they were sending a message and saying, we're not coming at this from the radical right, guys. We're not worried about communists at this point. We're worried about what our foundations are. So they came up with this program called Exploring the American Idea, and it's a reading and discussion program, and they launched it throughout the various communities that existed in New York. And you know, when you're dealing with New York, you're dealing with multiple communities, multiple types of communities, multiple populations. So it so happened that the 75th anniversary of ALA was coming. And they kind of appropriated the idea. They had a theme for the 75th anniversary called the Heritage of the United States in a Time of Crisis. They actually called it a time of crisis. And they got funding from the Fund for Adult Education, which is a Ford Foundation fund source, for $150,000. Now today that wouldn't be so much, but in the early 50s that was a lot of money. And it became the American Heritage Project. And so this discussion series about investigating what democracy means in our country, they didn't take on McCarthy. They embraced a discussion of the idea of democracy. And they fostered that across the country. It became the American Heritage Project, and it eventually included film discussion groups as well. So not just books, but they went on to include film. And it did an awful lot to increase the visibility of public libraries in their communities. This is a quote from one of the reports. The quality and the content of the discussion is unusually good. This is not only due to the leaders and materials, but also to the great variety of the educational, religious, and racial backgrounds of the participants, as well as their occupations. Sounds a little multicultural. There are old and new Americans, Puerto Ricans. I don't know why they're different. There are old and new Americans, Puerto Ricans, American Negroes, Europeans, lawyers, actors, clerks, Catholics, Jews, and Protestants, high school graduates, and others with advanced degrees, young adults, and some not so young. So what we're seeing is a plurality drawn from the various communities participating in these discussions. Now, by 1950, the TV was around. It wasn't as diffuse in the population, but TV was around. But they were still getting, I don't have the kind of numbers of participation for this, but they still got the turnout. In exploring the American idea, it also carried the program beyond the library. So they would house these discussions in the libraries across the country, but they would also take them out to church groups. So they stopped, they got out from behind the walls, which is something that we all have to start doing. Get out from behind the walls, go to meet with church groups, took the program to senior centers, translated the programs into different language variations, and had them in different language meeting places. Some of the discussion groups actually moved from discussion to community action. So as a result of some of the readings, members of the community became actively engaged in pursuing some activity of benefit to the community. So it was a very dynamic flow of energy from planning to reading to discussing to acting. And the library initiated this. And importantly, Importantly, it expanded the significance of the library. It expanded. And it based everything we've talked about with our library education, about how public libraries are tied to the democratic principles of the U.S. come out of this period. And the library was intentionally wedded to the concepts of democracy. So the point is we have a foundation that we can work with, that we don't have to start from scratch. We have this tradition in our practice. And there are things that have sucked us away from this kind of social engagement, technology being a big one. I mean, we spent a lot of time, energy, and money getting our technical infrastructure in place. And it was no minor task, believe me. I know. But it's done. Yeah, there's some things. Yeah. There are issues, we know that. But the big forklift into the 20th century is really complete. Now we can go back to what we really thought library was all about, which is enabling social engagement, enabling strengthening our communities, enabling the individual within our community to pursue their areas of interest. So, what are some contemporary options? I think we're going to talk about the Building Common Ground program next week, right? But for instance, I know the folks at Calvert County Public Library, they have a program of civil discourses that's been going on for a few years now. And they do something very similar to what Tolman does. They actually set up both sides of an issue. So they have issues, for instance, about whether bluefish fishing should be capped. And they'll bring someone in, and it's going to be quite a heated discussion. Because it's bluefish fishing is primo in Southern Maryland. So they'll bring someone to say, yes, it should be. And they'll bring in someone to say, no, that it shouldn't be. And they'll present both sides of the issue. They had, now this is Maryland, so 2 years ago, they wanted to do a presentation on gay marriage. So they wanted to have someone come in and defend gay marriage, and they wanted to have someone come in and argue against it. But Robin said they couldn't do the program because they couldn't get anyone to come in and argue against it. Okay, and so the next year, Maryland, of course, passed a gay marriage bill. But that's the strategy that they use. They set up both sides, and they've been doing it for a couple years. They have great turnout. And again, it increases that visibility and the dynamic role of the library in the community. Howard County Public Library has something similar, where they also set up opportunities for civil discourse by developing programs that engage the community in addressing issues that are of concern to that community. They don't all have to be grand issues. We could have a program on whether WISCNet should be unfunded and have someone say, no, it shouldn't be because this is why, and yes, it should be because this is why, and set that kind of program up. We are not abandoning any neutrality at that point in time. And we are exercising our authority by saying this is a good person to speak on this issue, and this is a good person to speak on this issue, because we don't want the crackpots standing up on stage spouting off anything. We want people that can present valid perspectives on each position, right? That's where our authority comes in. We're the ones that can identify the best resources to address topics. There's a community forums network out of Washington State. There's the National Institute for Civil Discourse at the University of Arizona. You can imagine how much Arizona needs that. There is the Center for Civil Discourse at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. In other words, this concept of enabling the communities to come together, whatever the politicians are doing, we don't know what they're doing. Politicians are playing their own games. We need to put them aside and stop engaging with their agendas and begin to enable engagement on our own agendas. And as public librarians, we're uniquely positioned to enable that. And I'm going to talk often. As a public library director, I did a lot of visiting with politicians. You wouldn't know it. I'm one of the few people to have support from the most leftist member of the New York State Senate and the most right-wing member of the New York State Senate. I had them both in my service area. They both loved me, all right? I could talk to both of them. And I could bring them both together at my library. And we could have a program that didn't involve either one of them having to take a position. And I got money from both of them. I got a lot of money from state politicians. There are ways, and we had a banned book celebration every year where we had politicians come in and read from banned books. And we did it as a kind of fundraiser. It wasn't really successful as a fundraiser, but it did get all the politicians into our library. And I used to go visit politicians with board members and community members. And it really does make a difference, as Lee was saying, I'm sure you know this, to have a constituent come along. So it's not just us or me. But we can do this. This is something that can position us well and that can strengthen us in the eyes of the power holders, and that can enable we can enable the communities to advance their own agendas with those powers. Any questions? Lights? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so the discussion is over. What happens with what happened today? What's the point?
Well, I would close out the discussion with reading list and materials out front that address the topic that people can check out. You're right, I wouldn't just leave it because who knows what's going to happen in the parking lot. But I would give people a takeaway. Okay, here we are. Thank you all for coming tonight. On the seat by the door, you'll find reading lists that address both of these, the pros and cons of these positions. And the library doesn't have to do anything. It should come out of the community.
I think having our blogs and websites so that participants could continue the discussion, voice their opinion, given the resources so that.
I mean, I think that's a great way of extending it. You could have the blog, if you're going to have what Coward County does and what Howard and Calvert do, is they announce their series at the beginning of the year. So they have, I think, 6 sessions. So, and you can close out a discussion board at the end of a session, and and then everybody go off in the summer and do their summer things and start fresh then back in the new year. But yeah, that's a way of using technology and to set up the engagement. I mean, if we look at what some of these community newspapers have done, these Patch, Wood Patch, I mean, what they've done by using the local digital newspaper to coordinate activities within the community, that's a good model to look at for how to continue the discussion. All right, did you have a question?
I think it was similar to Pat's, and the fact is too, thinking, I'm beginning to hear more of like church groups talking about, gee, if people can't come here to talk, where else can they go? And libraries seem to be doing this. So are you seeing more partnerships and with the technology available, being able to have these programs simultaneously, maybe at different locations?
That would I haven't thought about that. I think one of the things we want to do in order to focus on the library as the place of discourse, to keep coming back to this idea of place, in order to keep everybody is that's where I would start. Okay, if for instance, then it becomes possible to report things out. I don't think people engage. This is from knowing about distance ed. I don't think people engage from a distance to the same extent that they engage in the room. Better to take a program around to different places.
I actually don't agree with that.
Okay.
I teach in the classroom and online at the college level. And what I've found is that when the barrier of what do I look like, what am I going to sound like when I speak out loud, what are they going to think, who's going to stare at me, that online conversation I've experienced oftentimes, especially over the type of programs you described, which I think are fabulous. It's more than all of our systems libraries. When you have that protection of simply being able to type and look at a screen versus having everybody stare at you while you talk, I've seen engagement much more robust in an online environment.
Another perspective there.
However, connected to that is, I think, part of the focus of this whole thing is civil behavior. Because all you have to do is go online and follow a newspaper article, blog, or anything like that, and see that the anonymity of being able to post what you think online removes those barriers of civility. And I'm not talking about an online classroom, but if you're talking about a blog that's going to follow up a contentious conversation, right? I mean, I think that's my personal belief is that the ability to communicate anonymously is part of what's at the heart of the loss of civility in our society overall. And that the lack of face-to-face communication where we need to look our opponent in the eye and say what we think. I mean, I think that's part of what's going to community back together, is getting those people in the room and having them talk to each other in that way. And not to, I mean, there's no way we can get away without using technology for this stuff these days. Everything's just expected to be online. But I really think that if we are moving to a place of civility, that it's that face-to-face kind of thing that's going to help us support that type of conversation.
And apropos of that observation, some of the right-wing strategists actively pursue negative commentary. I mean, that's a strategy. The pursuit of negative discourse, the overwhelming negativity that we're hearing coming at us, is a strategy that's designed to drive people off the field. I mean, you can't take the heat, we'll win the field. And often the comments that you see, you'll see 5 or 6 people all weighing in and saying, yeah, that guy's a crackpot. Oh, they are so screwed up to be doing. It's all one person. It's an active strategy. And you can go on YouTube and find the videos about how to control the discourse around an online topic. And people who use that strategy, and both sides use it, their intent is to narrow the field of engagement. That's the actual intent. If we can narrow the field of engagement, it's like restricting the number of people that can vote. If we can narrow the field of engagement, we have a better chance of controlling the outcome in our favor. So to open up space, to make it available for discourse, to say we aren't going to take on the negativity, we're going to create an alternative, is the same thing that New York Public and the ALA did in 1950. They did not take on McCarthy. They created an alternative. They created an alternative discourse. They created an alternative strategy. Librarians did that. We can still do that. I get carried. In case you didn't notice. All right. Thank you all very much.